Okay, so in the previous tutorial, we made it so that we can move this object, this player, in the X and Z directions, right? So we have X and Z direction motion, and we can jump from a previous tutorial. So now the issue is, right, when we're looking through the scene window, we can see what we're doing, but if we look through the play window, right, our sphere is going in, right? You know, as long as we keep it within view, we're good, but what would be great is if we could actually have the camera track with the player, right? So if you imagine we're moving through a much larger world, we'd want to be able to follow the character with our camera. And so that's what this tutorial is going to go over, is how to do that in Bolt. Okay, so I've paused it, I've got my player, I've got my plane, and what we need to do is we need to be able to follow the player. And so, you know, as you may have already surmised, what we need is we're going to need to be able to take the transform from the player, and we're going to need to apply it to our main camera's transform. But we don't want to do all of the transform, and we want to be able to keep things up, right? If I just went straight over and said, let's set the camera's transform to the player's transform, what's going to happen is the camera is going to end up right in the middle of the player. We're not going to see the player. We're just going to be kind of looking outward. Now, we can also take all of this motion that we've created, we can apply it to the camera itself, the camera objects itself, and then we can move that around as a player, which is the way you do first person, but we're looking at like the third person kind of up above and behind the player as the player goes through the world. And so to do that, right, we don't want to just strictly migrate the transform of this. We actually want our camera to be, you know, up above in the Y direction and aimed down slightly at our player so it can see our player as we're going. And then it also needs to be able, what we really want is we want to know the X and Z position, but we're going to want to be able to have the camera sit behind about the same number of units back as it is right now. But we want to have that be able to sit behind the player, right? So it's always at the same motion, at the same point. And if we jump, the camera lifts up with the player as well. So let's get started. So I'm going to go ahead and select my main camera. And in order to do this, I'm going to need to create a new flow graph that's attached to this camera. So I'm going to click on Add Component, and I'm going to go to Bolt, and I'm going to say Flow Machine. And when I do that, right, I'm going to need to create a new macro. And so I'm going to go ahead and click New, and I'm going to call this, you could call it Camera Follow. I'm just going to, I know I've already created one and it's saved in my assets folder. And so rather than that, I'm going to call it Follow Player. Although usually if you're searching online for tutorials about camera following or following a player or something with your camera, usually it's called Camera Follow. That's the standard way people name it. So just as a heads up. So follow player. I'm going to open this up. It's created these two units here, the start and the update. We don't really need the start. I'm going to leave it there for now. We're probably not going to use that event at all, but we need the update event. Okay, so the first thing I said that we need is we definitely need to know what we should do before we do anything else is set our camera position. And so you'll see already Z is -10. And so I'm going to go ahead and set Y equal to 10 as well. Right now, what that does is, right, it's lifting my camera up in the air. And then the last thing I need to do is I need to do the rotation. Now, which axis do I want to rotate in, right? You might think, oh, well, it's, you know, it's up in the vertical direction. I want to aim down, so I'd want to use the Y, but that's not accurate. An easy way to do this is to have your move tool selected so you can see your axes pretty well, and then click and drag, and you'll see how that rotation affects it, right? Y rotation is actually, these are all rotations around the axis that they're located on, right? So the green axis is Y, and this rotation is happening around it. So I'm going to undo that. If I do around the Z right, it's actually going to be rotation around this direction. So what I really want is I want the Z arrow to point down, which means I need to rotate around the X. And so I'm just going to set this to negative, I could do negative 45. Oops, sorry, should be positive 45. Okay, so positive 45. Now I'm pointed down at the sphere here, or my player object. And so I've got my default settings set. So I've set Y to 10, Z to negative 10, and X to 40, the X rotation to 45 degrees for the transform on my main camera. So now what I need to do is I'm going to need to get those values, potentially. But more importantly, I'm going to need to set some values, right? And so what do I really need to get? I need to get the transform of this, right? I'm not so worried about rotation or scale, but really I need to get the position of this sphere. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to say, I'm going to right click in my flow graph, and I'm going to say capital T transform dot get. And if I just get the transform, that's not really what I want. What I want is to get the position. So I want transform.position. And the very first option is get. So I'm going to say transform position.get. And what now the transform that I want in here is not self, right? That would mean I'd be getting the transform from the camera itself. What I want is the transform of the sphere. So how do I go about getting that transform? What I do is I need to create a variable that can hold the transform of the sphere. And so I'm going to go ahead and say, I'm just going to call it player transform. So I know when I look at it, I know exactly what it is. I'm going to hit plus. And the type, instead of being null, there's a whole bunch of options here, but you'll notice we haven't talked about this, but there is a search bar here. If I type in capital TRANS, transform is my first option. Okay, so I've got my player transform, and now I need to see if I can actually get this value to update. So if I grab my player object from the hierarchy and just click drag and try and drop it in this plane, nothing happens. Now, this is problematic because then if I try and come over here, I can't find it even this way. So what I'm going to do is this is not in the correct place, right? And you'll see it says these variables are local to the graph, and there's some that are these are to the object, to the scene, to the app, etc. We're going to actually what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of that variable over here, and we're actually going to come over to the variables in our object in the camera, right? So I want to make sure I have my main camera selected. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to do it in this field. And so when I do that, I'm going to go ahead and I've selected the field, and I'm just going to say player transform. I'm going to hit plus. I'm going to go through the same settings. So I'm going to go down to, I'm going to search for transform. There we go. And now the value still says none, but now that I've done it here as a variable for my camera instead of in the graph, what I can do now more successfully is click drag the player, right? You don't click and then let go because that switches, right? So if I just clicked, it switches to the player. What I want to do is select my camera and then click drag this over here, and oh, for some reason when I did that, it didn't actually set. Hold on a second. Okay, so with player transform set to type transform, what I need to do is I need to click drag player over here, right? So that doesn't mean I click once and then click and drag. I actually have to just click and hold, drag this over, and drop it in this field when it turns blue. And so now the player transform is set to this. And so now what I need to do is I need to take this variable and pull it into my graph. Okay. So now what I can do, and I'm just going to move these around so it's a little bit easier to see. So what I want to do is I just want to take this player transform and drop it in here. Okay, so we're getting the transform, the position variables, because we don't need the rotation or anything from our player. We're just getting the position. And now we need to do something to that position in order to split this out and be able to use the X and Z position. But we don't, but there's things that we want to do to that information. But first, let's try and pull this out. So, if I click on this and I just click once out here, you'll see that there are, several options here that I've got. So let's click on vector 3. And you'll see there's expose, there's equals, there's a lot of gets, but it doesn't really allow us to get all three of them at once, which is kind of frustrating. The only option to expose is to expose this vector 3, which creates this massive, massive object. Or we can go and get the individual things and just create multiple objects. Because this takes up so much visual space in the scene, even though it'd be totally functional, I'm going to go ahead and right-click and delete this. And instead, I'm going to just right-click in space, and I'm going to say vector3 dot get. And as soon as I even type in .ge, even though it's not what we're doing here, we do want to get X, Y, and Z. So I'm going to get X, and I'm going to pull this out here. Then I'm going to right-click and say add unit, vector3 dot, and we'll start with Z, and pull this down, and this is going to pull Z out. Now, this is a lot of work. This is one of those cases where it might be nice to make a super unit that just gets X, Y, and Z and outputs X, Y, and Z, because it's something you're going to use a lot. In fact, I don't understand why there isn't a default unit for it that just splits out these three variables. And so I'm going to go ahead and get Y as well, because we will need that for the jump. So vector3 dot, if I just do dot Y and say get, there we go. And right, so I've got these three things here. And so what I'm going to need to do now is I know in the end what I want to do is take these things that I get out of here. I want to make sure that I maintain this value of 10 here in the Y and negative 10 in the Z. I want those to be essentially added or subtracted to the values that I'm getting from here so that the camera stays where it's supposed to be. And so how do I do that, and how do I make sure everything works well? But the last thing I need to do is I'm going to need to set the transform for this, so the position in particular. So if I right click, go to add unit, and I go to transform dot position, you can see that I've got transform position set. So that's the end goal, is to set this position. And so the first thing I'm going to do, you'll notice this is all grayed out, and this is the only thing with flow into it, right? Because it's whenever you're getting something, right, which is all we've done here, is we've grabbed this variable to tell us to get this position, to get these variables from that position. And it's when you start setting things or doing things is when you need that flow to be connected. So we're going to be setting this position, and we need to do a couple things. So first, the X variable is the simplest because it's going to just be identical. We're just in the X direction. This is moving, should be moving exactly where this is in the X direction. So we're going to need a way to combine all of these into a vector 3. So we're going to say add unit, and then just, we could type in new and then vect, and it'd be new vector 3, and the specific one we want is new vector 3 xyz. So we've got this. So with x, we can just run x in here. Now you'll note this needs a flow as well, so I was a little ahead of myself, but we'll definitely need to connect through there. Okay, so x is just going to be x, and this is going to run in here. Now we need to deal with y and z. And to do y and z, we need to look at what our current positions of y and z are for our main camera. So y is 10, and z is negative 10. And so there's a couple things that we can that we can do. Now the trick is we'd say, oh, why don't we just use these position variables? Why don't we just get the position transform from our camera and feed them in here? Now the issue with that is that, right, if you're getting the position transform here and your position's 10 and you're essentially saying, well, let's add that 10 onto whatever the y position is, or negative 10 onto whatever the z position is, what happens is each loop, so it's, so you have it as negative 10, and even if you're not moving anything, the next loop it says, oh, well, the position was negative 10, and then it essentially adds another negative 10 and another negative 10 and on, and so the camera will fly backwards or fly up into the sky away from this, right? Because it just keeps updating these things, because what we're doing at the end of this thing is we're setting the transform of the camera. And so if we set that transform to negative 10 and then we set it to another add 10 and on and on and on, things get crazy really quick. So what we need to do is we just need a hard value that we add after we pull this out. And to do that, we just come over here, click once, click a second time, and we're going to say we'll use an add unit. And there's a couple things we could do. For right now, to make it simple and fast, I'm just going to hard code this in at 10. I'm going to say we don't want this to change, and if we want it to change, we'll come down here and we'll fix it. You could also put in a floating point variable. Right, you could create a floating point variable that would allow you to adjust these values on the fly, or there might be a thing where maybe if your character's moving above a certain speed, you want the camera to be able to pull further back from them so you can see further ahead, or maybe you want it to tilt lower, right? You want the Y to change, and maybe you actually want that rotation to lift up a little bit, right? There may be different cases where you want to be able to change the position of the camera relative to your character. And so that's something where you might want variables eventually, but right now, we're just going to hard code these values in here. So where it says B, I can click on that one and I can just type in 10. And then I can pull that into the Y. And then with the Z, I can do the exact same thing. Now I could do subtract and 10, or I could do add and negative 10. It doesn't really matter. It means exactly the same thing to the computer. It might be useful just to have both be additions, because then they're uniform. And so then I can just say negative 10 and snap this into the Z. Now with all of that, hopefully the camera will follow things correctly, and we'll see if we made any mistakes in the process. So I'm going to go ahead and hit play. All right, so the camera isn't flying away. That's a good sign. So now if I move in the X direction, you can see in the scene window, and you can kind of see with this is why we're going to add these textures here, is because, at least in here, it's almost impossible to see if this sphere is moving back and forth. Okay, and then if I go forward and backward, same thing, it moves, and if I jump, it jumps with it, right? So now this camera is locked on to this particular character. Excellent. Okay, so we have succeeded in doing this. So let's go ahead and just to tap on to the end of this tutorial, we're going to look at how to apply texture maps to our objects. So I'm going to go ahead and pause that. I'm going to go back to the project pane, and I'm going to click on the main assets folder. Now I've already added this, But what I want you to do is this texture file, it's just a PNG of an illusion, an optical illusion that I downloaded off the internet. And so all you're going to need to do is go ahead and take a moment to download that asset if you haven't already. And if you have downloaded it, move that folder in your Finder or File Explorer to your Assets folder. The other thing you can do is you can right-click in here, and you can go down to Import New Asset, and then you can go and you can find it if you've got it in, say, your Downloads folder or somewhere else on your computer. And you could put any JPEG or PNG file in here. So if you have something totally ridiculous that you want to add, go for it. As long as you can see that you're moving, I'm happy. Okay, so I called this file texture test. It's already in there, so we'll just pretend I found it somewhere else and I've imported it. Now, once I do that, it should come up and be selected right away, and you'll see that there's a bunch of options here, and we're going to leave everything at the default. But you'll note that there's several different types of textures that can be brought in. Now, if you've done 3D modeling stuff before, you might know what a normal map is. There's the GUIs, the graphic user interface. These are meant to be special items for that. Sprites are when we work in 2D mode and with UI. We'll talk about what sprites are. Note you can bring in custom cursors, and we'll talk a bit about shadow masks and light maps. I honestly don't know what a cookie is, and single channel doesn't matter either, right? So we're going to say default. It should be a 2D texture shape, not a cube texture shape. Everything else should be happy here. Okay. If you make any changes, you'll want to click the apply button down here, but we don't need to worry about that for now. Okay, so texture's in. So now, in my case, I actually need to create a new material to apply to this sphere because I created a new sphere. So I'm going to just go really quickly do that. You don't need to do this unless you've created a new sphere as well. So I'm going to come over here, and I'm just going to set the color to something. And I think I made it a bit more metallic last time, and I can't remember, maybe a bit smoother. Okay. And for some reason that color did not set. There we go. Okay. So now that I've done that, I've got this new material. I probably could have put it in my materials folder, but who cares? I can click on this and I can apply it to that sphere just by clicking and dragging in there. Or, right, I could select my player object and I could drag it down and do it here. So now that I've got this material component on my player, I'm going to make sure I select my player. I'm going to open this up, and these things may be closed up or they may be open. But so under surface inputs, there's this base map. And if I click on the little dot next to it, you'll see that any image file that's appropriate that's in my project is going to show up here. And so I'm just going to scroll down through all of these assets that I'm not using until I reach this texture test. I'm going to select that, and you'll see it also kind of shows you how textures are applied to spheres. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to select the plane. And with the plane, it looks like in this case, my color is white. I want you to note too that anything that is white turns the color of the whatever color I've chosen here. So if you want something to be accurately colored, you want to have your base map be white as your base color. So I'm going to click on the little dot again, come down here, I'm going to find that texture, and I'm going to drop it on. Now you'll note it's not perfectly white, and that's because our light color in the scene is a little bit warm. And so that's what's causing this. Okay, so now that I've added those textures, if you want to, you can always change the color of this so I can make this really obnoxious if I wanted to, which I do. Okay, so now I'm playing this and I just want to show you how these things work, right? So that image is basically glued to the sphere, so you can see that as I roll the object, the texture rolls with it. But this also just makes it a lot easier, since there's no other objects around, for me to be able to see this. Okay. Ooh, I almost fell off the edge. All right, so this concludes this tutorial. We've got a camera to follow our character, and we, oh, there it goes, falling off the edge into infinity, right? And so now it's just going to fall forever and ever. But so we've also been able to apply these materials. Okay, definitely save your work. These are scripts that are completely reusable. And so I highly suggest you save everything you've done because you can use these in your projects.